Hi, I'm Rabbi Jeremy of Machar, the Washington Congregation for Secular Humanistic Judaism in Washington, D.C. Every month, during our Text on Tuesdays adult education sessions, we have a session that's dedicated to kind of recapping the Torah portions for the month and for identifying things from the Torah portion that are of historical interest or literary interest or moral interest to humanistic Jews in the Torah portion. And sometimes these are things that are just interesting historical notes. Sometimes they're a little bit more than that. This month, because we're changing around our adult ed schedule just a little bit to be able to wrap up a series on Maimonides and then start a few sessions on the history of Israelites prior to the Babylonian exile, we're putting our regular Torah portion wrap-up online, just directly online without having sessions on it, so that we can carve out the time for Maimonides, because his work takes a little time to parse. So this month there are 4 different Torah portions, and this video will cover the first of those 4 Torah portions, the joint portion of Chukat and Balak. And these are among the last few Torah portions in the Book of Numbers. So the Book of Numbers has really, up to this point, given us a couple of censuses and a number of stories about the Israelites in the desert and their general resistance to doing a lot of what Moses asks them to do. When we get to Chukat, we actually start off with just some legal texts. And specifically, we get this very unusual text focusing on what is frequently called the red heifer. So the red heifer is a cow of some kind, a red cow, that is specifically sacrificed, and the sacrifice is burned in order to perform a ritual that eliminates impurity from contact with dead bodies from Israelites. You can't enter the area of the tabernacle if you have contamination from dead bodies. You can't function as a priest if you are contaminated with impurity from dead bodies. So this is a major piece of what makes Israelite religion work. And it's a very unusual episode, a very unusual set of rules. And the rabbis, in looking at this, actually say, this is just a pure example of just what they call chok. So chok is rule or statute or law, but in this case, what they mean is this is a pure matter of law with no rational explanation to it, right? We can't find an explanation for why this ritual does anything. It just is required in the Torah. This is how you get rid of impurity from a dead body. It has nothing to do with how you got impure from a dead body. It just is. And so the rabbis view this as just pure law with no case behind it, no anything. It just is the rule. And that's a pretty good way of thinking about a rule that says you get rid of impurity from a dead body by burning a cow and sprinkling its ashes into water and then anointing tents and anointing items that have come into contact with dead bodies with this water plus ash. It's a little bit odd. And it is what it is. And where this comes up relatively often in modern life is there is a belief among a number of Jews that without the red heifer, you can't restart sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem. So if the temple in Jerusalem is rebuilt, we have to be able to do this ritual. And so every few years, you'll hear that there's an organization that's interested in restarting the temple on the site of the Temple Mount, and they will speculate that perhaps they have found the red heifer. And finding the red heifer might be an indication that the end times are coming and that the temple will be rebuilt, because we have this cow that is the appropriate cow for us to use. How anybody exactly knows, I don't really know. No one has done the red heifer ritual in at least 2,000 years. What the red heifer actually looks like, who knows? But this is associated with the red heifer and the temple and this text. So it's worth noting that every so often you'll hear about this stuff in Jewish news media in particular. And that's one of the highlights of Parshat Chukat. And the other highlight of Chukat, right, this is Chukat and Balak. So the other highlight is Parshat Balak. And Parshat Balak is actually a story that's somewhat well known. There's art about it, like Renaissance and modern art about this story. So this is the story of Balak, who is a foreign king who wants to defeat the Israelites. And it is also a story involving a prophet named Balaam. That's how his name is usually pronounced, is Balaam among English-speaking Bible readers. His Hebrew name is Balaam, the stress at the end, and with an I instead of an A sound. And Balaam appears to have been, if not a real person, there are other ancient Middle Eastern texts that talk about Balaam ben Beor, Balaam son of Beor, this prophet that's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, in Parshat Balak, right, or in Chukat Balak, because they're joined this year. And the basic story goes that Balak wants to defeat the Israelites because he sees that the Israelites have grown great in number, and he knows they have to pass through his territory to get to where they're going. And so he consults with Balaam, or tries to consult with Balaam, to say, Balaam, I need a prophecy that tells me that I'm going to win. This is essentially the request that he's making. And Balaam says, okay, I'm going to go, and I'm going to give this prophecy. And initially, he has trouble getting going because his donkey won't take him. So he starts riding his donkey, and the donkey is being compelled not to take him. And eventually the donkey can see what Balaam cannot, which is that there's an angel with a sword in front of the donkey. It's a fantastical story, but here we are. This is what's in the Torah. And Balaam strikes the donkey and tries to get the donkey to move. And finally, the donkey starts talking to Balaam and saying, I can't keep going. There's an angel there with a sword. Can't you see the angel with the sword? Like, it's a fantastical story. Eventually, Balaam is brought by Balak to a site where Balaam tells Balak to set up some altars and offer some sacrifices. And Balak continues to say, you're going to give me a prophecy that shows that I'm going to win. And Balaam continues to say, I can only tell you what God allows me to tell you. And that's what Balaam continues to do. And so multiple times they try to get the right prophecies and they try to get sacrifices accepted, and it never really works. And eventually the Israelites do defeat Balak. So this Balaam story is interesting as a story, right? Talking donkeys, not in a movie featuring ogres from DreamWorks. But it's also an interesting parallel to other ancient Near Eastern texts, because it's one of the few times we see the name of a biblical personality in another ancient Near Eastern text, and for that matter, in another culture's ancient Near Eastern texts. So the other prophecies recorded by, or said to have been reported by Balaam, are actually found in an Aramaic inscription on plaster from around the 8th century BCE. It is the first written Aramaic in an alphabet that anybody has, and it is these prophecies attributed to Balaam. So sometimes the biblical text seems fantastical, and then there are these parallels that occur that are a little bit surprising. And this is one of those times. The way Parshat Balak ends is one that I think as humanistic Jews we've got to be very concerned about and take very seriously. And it is the story of Pinchas. Pinchas is one of the members of the priestly family that descends from Aaron, according to the Torah. And Pinchas is involved in an incident in which an Israelite man and a Midianite woman engage in a conflict with another Israelite man. And during the fight between the two Israelite men, the Israelite man who's married to the Midianite woman utters a curse. And as a result of uttering the curse, you utter a curse like this and you are supposed to be punished with death. And part of the question becomes, what do you do with the Midianite woman? Because the Midianite woman's not an Israelite. And the answer turns into, well, you kill them both. And Pinchas is the person who kills them both. He runs them through with a spear. And that's actually how the Torah portion ends for us, is with this episode. And when it picks up in the next Torah portion, which is called Parshat Pinchas, and is called that because it picks up the story of Pinchas, we see that this is viewed as, in the text of the Tanakh, as a praiseworthy act. And it raises some really important concerns for, I think, all modern Jews, but it should raise concerns, the entire episode should raise concerns for humanistic Jews as well. And some of these concerns are really tied into what the biblical attitude is toward intermarriage, what broader Jewish attitudes are toward intermarriage. The Torah's text implies, at least, that because the Israelite man was married to a Midianite woman, the marriage or the relationship is somehow tied up in the reason the Israelite man uttered a curse, which portrays actually a very negative version of an approach to intermarriage that we have to kind of balance against the fact that the biblical text seems to record an awful lot of Israelites marrying non-Israelites, and that this attitude may not reflect earlier Israelite ideology. It may reflect later ideology connected with even post-Babylonian exile concepts of rejecting intermarriage. And particularly we have the very vivid stories in the book of Ezra, where Ezra actually, we think Ezra lived around the 390s BCE, where Ezra, trying to reconstitute yet again an Israelite Jewish Yahwistic religion in Jerusalem, tells Jewish men, Judahite men, tells them to send away their foreign wives. And it's thought that the book of Ruth is a reaction to this kind of idea that there are people who can't really be accepted as Israelites. This story from Pinchas seems to echo with that idea as well. The idea that no, Israelite men should not be married to anybody other than Israelite women, and eventually it leads down a road that is harmful. And this is where Parshat Balak leaves us and where Parshat Pinchas will pick up. So we actually have some Torah portions here that are grounds to be a little bit concerned about how Jewish culture may view intermarriage. As humanistic Jews, we don't view intermarriage as a negative. We don't require conversion, right? We have the idea of adoption, that this is a two-way street. We don't reject families with intermarriages in any respect within the functioning of our communities. And this simply reflects a different understood reality about who non-Jews are and the role that they play in the lives of people who are Jewish. And we don't recognize functionally in our congregations a division. We simply don't. I officiated intermarriages about 90 to 95% of the time. 90 to 95% of the marriages that I officiate are one spouse is Jewish and the other is not. And the not can be any number of things, from somebody who views themselves as entirely secular to somebody who really does view themselves as a religious Catholic or a religious Protestant. And these relationships can still work, and they can still produce families that are devoted to Jewish culture and to Jewish life, as well as other ways of living. All of which is to say, our modern beliefs are not the same as what we find in the Tanakh, whether it's that donkeys can talk, that burning a red cow is how you get rid of impurity from contacting dead bodies, or whether it's our view of something as fundamental as family life and family structure. We'll be following this video up with one on Parshat Pinchas, and we'll follow that one up with a video on the joint Parshiot, the multiple Torah portions joined together of Matot and Maseh. And then the last one for this month will be Parshat Devarim, because the reading of Deuteronomy began this past weekend. And so we will be talking about Deuteronomy, which is framed as Moses' valedictory speech before the Israelites cross the Jordan River and before Moses himself dies and is buried, which is how the text of the Torah and the text of Deuteronomy ends.